In moments like this, power is rarely about speeches. It's about pressure. As Iranians pour into the streets, defying a regime that rules through fear and blood, the question is not whether the world is watching, it's whether the world is willing to act. President Donald Trump believes pressure works, economic pressure, diplomatic pressure, and, when necessary, military pressure. Locked and loaded, he wrote, as protests intensified and Tehran faced yet another test of survival. This is not about rushing to war. It's about forcing a regime into a corner so narrow it must choose between repression and collapse. Trump has done this before, raising costs, shrinking options, creating dilemmas Iran's leaders cannot easily escape. If you want to understand what real leverage looks like in geopolitics, stay with me, because the tools on the table are not symbolic, they're precise, and they are devastating. But to see why these options matter now, we need to step back and understand the strategic problem Iran presents. Good, I'll continue. At the center of this moment is a simple but dangerous reality. Iran is under pressure from below and scrutiny from above. Inside the country, protests expose the fragility of a regime that survives through repression. Outside, Iran's military capabilities remain the regime's ultimate insurance policy. For Washington, the challenge is not emotional, it is structural. How do you weaken a government without unifying it against a foreign enemy? How do you apply force without triggering full-scale war? Trump's answer has always been asymmetric pressure targeting systems, not cities. Capabilities, not civilians. This is why military options are being discussed alongside protests, not instead of them. The goal is not regime change by invasion. The goal is to strip Tehran of the tools it uses to intimidate its neighbors, deter intervention, and crush dissent at home. When those tools erode, the balance inside Iran shifts. And to understand how this strategy emerged, we need to look at the deeper context, how Iran built its power, and why those foundations are now vulnerable. For decades, Iran has pursued power the way weaker states often do, quietly, patiently, underground. Sanctions hardened this instinct. Isolation refined it. What emerged was a strategy built not on conventional armies, but on missiles, proxies, and denial. If Iran could not match its rivals openly, it would make itself untouchable. Missiles became the backbone of that strategy, not just as weapons, but as political tools, signals of reach, deterrence, and defiance. Underground facilities spread across the country, shielding launchers, fuel, and production lines from easy retaliation. Over time, this architecture turned Iran into a state that could threaten without provoking immediate war. Then came space. Satellites and launch vehicles blurred the line between civilian ambition and military capability. Rockets that put payloads into orbit could just as easily deliver warheads across borders. Each launch expanded knowledge, range, and confidence. This system worked until it didn't. Iran expended missiles, revealed positions, and drew attention to the very infrastructure meant to stay hidden. Pressure accumulated, surveillance improved, and suddenly, the foundations of Iran's deterrence looked less permanent than planned. That vulnerability set the stage for the first real test. The test came not as theory, but as action. Operation Midnight Hammer was not a broad assault. It was selective by design. A message delivered with precision. Specific nuclear enrichment and weapons design facilities were hit, not to shock the world, but to eliminate a single dangerous pathway, Iran's ability to sprint toward a bomb. What made the strike notable was not what it destroyed, but what it left untouched. Underground missile complexes, hidden launchers, fuel production sites. The architecture of Iran's broader military power remained intact. This was restraint, not hesitation, a calculated pause. Then came the warning. Trump made the red line unmistakable. If American forces were targeted, Iran would be hit at levels they've never been hit before. History gave that warning weight. Al-Udeid in 2015, Al-Assad in 2020, These were not hypotheticals, they were reminders. If you're trying to understand how modern deterrence works, this is it. Pressure calibrated, escalation controlled, force held in reserve. And here's the crucial point. Midnight Hammer wasn't the main event. It was the opening move. Because behind the scenes, far more consequential options were already on the table. What really matters in this confrontation is not a single strike, but the system beneath it. Iran's military power is not centralized in one headquarters or one weapons program. It's distributed, layered, designed to survive partial damage. That's why any serious pressure campaign focuses on production, not just deployment. Missiles don't threaten because they exist today. They threaten because they can be rebuilt tomorrow. Iran continues to manufacture ballistic missiles, importing key solid fuel precursors and dispersing production across dozens of sites above and below ground. This is industrial warfare, not battlefield combat. Break the factories and the launchers become irrelevant. Cut the supply chains and deterrence decays, quietly, month by month. This is the logic behind targeting missile production. It doesn't create dramatic explosions on television, but it slowly hollows out a regime's confidence. The same logic applies to air defenses. Rebuilding them is costly, slow, and visible. Every attempt exposes Iran to surveillance, pressure, and further strikes. This is how modern power is dismantled, not all at once, but piece by piece. And once that process begins, the regime faces a second, far more destabilizing crisis. The second crisis emerges above the earth, not beneath it. Iran's space program looks civilian on the surface, but in strategic terms, it is inseparable from its missile ambitions. Rockets that lift satellites into orbit also perfect guidance, propulsion, and range. The line between space launch and strike capability is thin, and Iran knows it. Iran already has dozens of satellites in orbit. More were launched with Russian assistance, expanding surveillance and signaling technological resilience. But each launch also raises alarms. When Iran fired an undeclared ballistic missile from the Imam Khomeini spaceport, it wasn't just a technical milestone. It was a political one, testing limits, defying sanctions, normalizing escalation. Now new facilities are coming online. New launch sites, new infrastructure. Each one increases reach, but also exposure. Space launch complexes are large, fixed, and difficult to conceal. They are symbols of ambition and vulnerabilities in plain sight. This is why they matter. Space is not a side project. It's the fastest way for Iran to regenerate long-range strike capacity under another name. Shut it down, and you don't just delay launches. You fracture momentum. And when momentum breaks, the consequences are no longer abstract. They land directly on ordinary people inside Iran. And this is where strategy stops being abstract and becomes personal. Because when military systems weaken, the shockwaves don't stay inside bunkers or command rooms. They move outward, toward daily life, toward you. A regime that can no longer project strength abroad often tightens its grip at home, or it fractures under the weight of its own fear. If missile factories stall, if space programs freeze, if drone production collapses, the regime loses more than weapons. It loses confidence. And regimes without confidence behave unpredictably. Sometimes harsher, sometimes desperate. Sometimes suddenly negotiable. For ordinary Iranians, this moment is terrifying and full of possibility. Pressure on the system creates cracks. Cracks create choices. And choices are what authoritarian power fears most. You don't see this on satellite images. You feel it in inflation, in fear, in whispers, in courage. This is why external pressure matters, not as punishment, but as leverage. If you believe geopolitics is only about states, you're missing the point. It's always about people. And what happens next won't be decided only inside Iran, because the consequences are already spreading far beyond its borders. Iran's military capabilities were never meant for domestic use alone. They are outward-facing, by-design signals sent across borders, across seas, across alliances. Missiles don't just threaten Israel. They reach southern Europe. Drones don't just fly over Ukraine. They reshape battlefields and alliances. That is why the world is watching closely. France, Germany, Great Britain, all have already condemned Iran's space launch activities, not as symbolic gestures, but as strategic warnings. Europe understands geography. Missiles launched from Iran don't stop at regional boundaries. They redraw security calculations from the Middle East to NATO's eastern flank. This is why missile defense systems matter, why Aegis ashore installations in Poland and Romania were activated, why US Navy destroyers track launches in real time. When Iranian missiles were intercepted before, it wasn't just defense, it was proof that escalation has limits. Global pressure works when it's shared. When deterrence is layered, when one regime's ambition forces cooperation among rivals who might otherwise disagree, Iran is discovering that isolation today is different from isolation 20 years ago. The system is tighter, faster, less forgiving, and that reality sets the stage for the final, unavoidable question. What comes next? The future now branches into three paths. None of them are clean. All of them are revealing. The first is restraint. Under sustained pressure, Iran slows its missile production, curtails space launches, and reduces drone output. Not because it wants to, but because rebuilding becomes too costly, too visible, too risky. The regime survives, weakened, forced into quieter behavior. The second is defiance. Iran pushes forward anyway, rebuilds in secret, tests limits. This path invites repeated strikes, tighter surveillance, and a cycle of degradation that never quite becomes war, but never truly ends. A permanent state of strategic exhaustion. The third is escalation, a miscalculation, a strike on US forces, a red line crossed. In that scenario, the response is overwhelming. Not symbolic, not calibrated, the kind of force designed to shatter remaining capabilities in days, not years. Here's the insight most people miss. None of these futures depend on ideology. They depend on systems, on production lines, on logistics, on whether pressure breaks momentum faster than ambition rebuilds it. History tells us something uncomfortable. Regimes rarely collapse because they are hated. They collapse when they can no longer function. And that brings us to the final question, what this moment actually means and why it matters to you. This moment is not about personalities. It's about power and how it erodes. Trump's approach to Iran is brutally simple. Don't chase symbols, break systems. Missiles that can't be rebuilt, space programs that stall, drones that never leave the factory floor. When those pillars crack, the regime's options narrow fast, not because anyone invaded, but because momentum died. Most Americans may dream of an Iran free from tyranny. That day may come, or it may not. But until then, the strategic question is smaller and more decisive. Can a regime that survives on intimidation still function when its military tools are shattered into a million pieces? Pressure, when applied precisely, doesn't just punish, it clarifies, it forces choices. And in geopolitics, clarity is power. If you want to understand how the modern world is really shaped, not by speeches, but by systems, this is the story to watch. Because what happens in Iran will echo far beyond it. If this analysis helped you see the bigger picture, share it. Stay with me, and in the next video, we'll examine what happens when pressure finally meets its breaking point.